Hello and welcome to Wyrd Wessex. I'm.
Andy,
What are you doing?
you're Andy. I knew you'd say that.
Yeah, well done.
I had a premonition.
I see. Well, then tell us what today's episode's about.
Well, it's a topic we've covered a little way back on the Dreams episode, but I thought it could do with an episode of its own. So we're going to be talking about John Barker and the Premonitions Bureau, because I wanted to do something a little bit lighter for a change.
Fair enough. Firstly, that does sound like something I'd say. Talking about the Premonitions Bureau, so it's almost like I had a premonition. Also, I do want to say you mentioned doing something lighter.
Yeah,
You remember last time we did this, right? You did listen back. It starts with like multiple deaths
yeah, I know.
of children.
Yeah, right. My bad, but I mean, at least people know what to expect.
Oh, I suppose so. That's the whole point of premonitions, I guess.
So yeah, before we get to the grim bit, I mean, who was this John Barker then?
Good question. John Barker was a British psychiatrist, pretty well regarded in his field. He spent a good chunk of his career working at Shelton Hospital in Shrewsbury. But here's the thing, outside of his conventional medical work, he had a massive, almost obsessive interest in the paranormal, the occult, and psychical research. He wasn't just some fringe amateur either, he was quite a respected figure in some of those circles as well. And it was that blend of professional, clinical mind and his deep dive into the unexplained that led him to set up something as wild as the Premonitions Bureau.
Yeah, so it's worth mentioning before, because it helps paint a fuller picture of the man of the era, that while Barker pushed for reforms to improve conditions in the hospital, he also engaged in some deeply problematic research. So he used things like aversion therapy, which involved electric shocks to try and discourage behaviours like addiction or even disturbingly homosexuality and cross-dressing.
Yeah, and just to be totally clear, this kind of practice is absolutely abhorrent and completely outdated. We're, of course, talking about it in historical context, and even if we find the Bureau itself interesting, we're not condoning this in any way at all.
So he was also a member of the Society for Psychical Research. So he was straddling these two very different worlds, the clinical, if sometimes misguided, and the outright paranormal. And this is what took him to Aberfan. At the time, he was researching for a book on whether it was possible to be scared to death.
Wait, so like actually scared to death, to die
Yep.
from fear?
Yeah, he'd heard that a boy had escaped unharmed from the school in the disaster, but later died of shock.
Wait a minute, back up, back up. We should probably explain what the disaster was.
Yeah, that's a fair point. So for anyone who might not know, the Aberfan disaster was an absolutely horrific event that unfolded on October 21st, 1966. Imagine a quiet coal mining village nestled in the valleys of South Wales. It's just past 9:15 in the morning. School's about to begin, and the children of Pantglas Junior School are likely setting up their classrooms.
But looming over the village, precariously perched on the mountainside, was a colossal man-made mountain of waste, a spoil tip from the local mine. This particular tip number 7, had been growing for years, heaped up with coal waste and shale. What people didn't fully grasp was it was sitting on a layer of natural springs, making the whole thing very unstable.
And that morning, after heavy rain, the unthinkable happened. The tip, saturated and unstable, suddenly lost its grip. Roughly 110,000 cubic meters of black slurry, a liquid landslide of mud, rock, and coal waste broke free. To give you an idea of the scale, that's enough material to fill about 1,500 double-decker buses, all rushing down a hillside. It plunged down the mountain at an incredible speed, picking up momentum and debris as it went, and it just engulfed the school.
In a matter of minutes, the landslide slammed into Panglas Junior School and 20 houses directly in its path. Imagine the sound, the sheer force of it. Walls crumpled, roofs caved in, and lives were extinguished in an instant. Out of the 144 people killed that day, a devastating 116 of them were children, trapped in their classrooms. Many of the bodies recovered were still clutching books or pencils.
But what he heard while he was there is exactly what would lead him to set up the Premonitions Bureau. He heard stories like that of a small boy who overslept for the first time ever, only to be sent rushing into the school in tears. He was then tragically crushed. Or another of a school bus running late due to thick fog, meaning all those children on board miraculously survived the incident. Weeks after the accident, the mother of an 8-year-old boy named Paul Davis, who died in Panglas School, found a drawing. He'd made it the night before the slide, showing masked figures digging in the hillside under the words, "The End."
And then there's the story of Errol May Jones, a 10-year-old girl reportedly not given to imagination.
Which seems an odd thing to say about a child.
Yeah, well, she told her mother, Megan, 2 weeks before the collapse that she wasn't afraid of death. Her mum naturally replied, "Why do you talk of dying, and you so young?" She tried to brush it off and said, "Do you want a lollipop?" But then, the day before the disaster, Errol May said to her mother in this incredibly matter-of-fact way,
"Mummy, let me tell you about my dream last night."
Her mother, probably busy, answered gently, "Darling, I've got no time, tell me again later." But the child replied,
"No, Mummy, you must listen. I dreamt I went to school and there was no school there. Something black had come down all over it."
The very next day, Errol May was buried in the school.
So it was these kinds of deeply disturbing accounts that really struck Barker. In the days after his visit to Aberfan, Barker came up with an idea for an unusual study. Given the singular nature of the disaster and its total penetration of the national consciousness, he decided he wanted to gather as many premonitions as possible of the event and then investigate the people who had them.
He wrote to Peter Fairley, who was the science editor for London's Evening Standard, who asked him to publicise the idea. On October the 28th, just a week after the disaster, Fairley carried Barker's appeal in his World of Science column, which ran on a Friday. He wrote, "Did anyone have a genuine premonition before the coal tip fell on Aberfan? That is what a senior British psychiatrist would like to know." The article described the kinds of visions Barker was interested in: a vivid dream, a vivid waking impression, telepathy at the time of the disaster, and clairvoyance. Interestingly, Fairley's comment implied the study was somehow unauthorised. Barker had asked to remain anonymous at first. The article even reminded readers of apparent foreknowledge of other major disasters, like the sinking of the Titanic in 1912 and the R-101 airship disaster in 1930, setting the stage for historical precedents.
Okay, so for anyone who might not know, the Titanic was the supposedly unsinkable luxury liner that famously went down on its maiden voyage after hitting an iceberg in 1912. But what's really weird is how many stories surfaced afterwards of people who'd had intense dreams of the ship sinking, or just an overwhelming feeling of dread that made them cancel their trip at the last minute. Some even claimed to have dreamt of the lifeboat and bodies in the icy water.
And the R-101 airship disaster in 1930 was similar. That was a huge British airship, a kind of massive, rigid, lighter-than-air craft that tragically crashed in France on its first overseas voyage, killing almost everyone on board. And this thing was huge, by the way. It was, it was said that you could fit the Titanic inside the actual airship, sort of the inflatable bit itself. But even
Might have stopped it sinking.
Yeah, that's it. But even before it even set off, there were reports of crew members having nightmares about it crashing, and even a famous medium claimed that she contacted the spirit of the airship's designer after his death, but before the official inquiry, who apparently gave her details about the mechanical faults that caused the crash. So the Evening Standard was really leaning into that angle, not just the disasters themselves, but the idea that these massive tragedies were somehow foreseen by people, selling the idea that premonitions could be real.
And this was in the Evening Standard, which was a huge paper at the time.
Massive. It had a circulation of almost 600,000, which brings us to one of the most intriguing responses he got. A woman named Miss Middleton liked to look through the paper in bed in the afternoon. She posted an account of her premonition on November the 1st. On the night of October the 20th, 1966, the very eve of the disaster, 52-year-old Miss Middleton decided to stay the night at one of her parents' inherited properties on Crescent Road in Hornsey. She was restless and ended up sleeping in a spare room on the first floor. The next morning, around 6 a.m, she had a powerful, visceral feeling of foreboding. I awoke choking and gasping with a sense of the walls caving in, she wrote soon afterwards.
Right, and her letter was just one of many, wasn't it? I mean, in total, Barker would go on to receive 76 replies to the Aberfan appeal. He wrote back to all percipients, as he called them. I don't know why that bugs me, that term, but that's what he calls them.
Yeah.
And he asked them for more details and witnesses for their experiences. Out of those, he found that 22 of the 60 plausible premonitions had actually been described before tip number 7 started to move.
Which for him was huge. This material really convinced Barker that precognition wasn't some super rare thing, that it might be pretty common amongst normal folks. He even speculated that it could be as common as something like left-handedness.
One other account comes from a guy named J. Arthur Taylor from Stacksteads up near the Lancashire moors. 2 nights before the disaster, the 63-year-old dreamed he was in Pontypridd down in South Wales, a place he hadn't been in years. He's trying to buy a book, facing this big machine with buttons. He wrote, and I quote, "Now I have never seen a computer. This may have been one. I just don't know." And then he looks up and all of a sudden I saw Aberfan written as if suspended in white lettering against a black background. This seemed to last some minutes. Then I turned and looked the other way, and I saw through a window rows of houses, and everything seemed derelict and desolate. But the thing is, at the time, he didn't even recognise the word Aberfan until he heard it on the radio the day of the disaster.
And then there's Constance Milder in Plymouth.
Sounds made up.
It does, doesn't it? It was Constance Milder in the attic with the candlestick. There's Constance Milder in Plymouth. The evening before the coal slide, she had this vision at a spiritualist meeting. She was 47 and she told 6 witnesses she saw an old schoolhouse, a Welsh miner, and an avalanche of coal rushing down a mountain. And get this, she said, at the bottom of this mountain of hurtling coal was a little boy with a long fringe looking absolutely terrified to death. Then, for quite a while, I saw rescue operations taking place. I had an impression that the little boy was left behind and saved. He looked so grief-stricken, and she later recognised the boy on the evening news.
And it wasn't just vision. Some people just had a really strong feeling, like R.J. Wallington, a man in Kent. For days before Aberfan, he was convinced that there'd be a national disaster on that Friday. He said, "It came to me as strongly as might come the thought that you'd forgotten that it was your wife's birthday tomorrow." When he rocked up to work on October 21st, he just flat out told his secretary, "Today's the day."
That's got to be chilling to hear, just in general, but especially in hindsight of what happened. There's also Grace Richardson in Hillingdon, London. A 30-year-old film technician. All week she was bothered by this intermittent, earthy, decaying smell, which she recognised as the smell of death. About an hour before the disaster, she actually asked a colleague, George Jordan, if he could smell anything unusual. He said no. But then about 15 minutes after the school was buried, Richardson just jumped up from her chair, totally overwhelmed, and said something terrible had happened. Jordan, her colleague, wrote in a note to Barker, her face was highly inflamed and she was breathing very heavily. Neither of us or anyone else in the machine room had mentioned or heard of any disaster.
And speaking of people who just knew something big was happening, you've got Alan Hencher. He worked on the Continental Telephone Exchange for the Post Office. In his letter to Barker, dated October 29th, just a day after that initial newspaper article, unlike some of the other folks who were maybe a bit unsure or, just trying really hard to convince Barker, Hencher sounded almost bored by it all. He wrote, "I accept that I am able to foretell certain events, but I have no idea how or why."
The most the most nonchalant reaction to psychic powers or powers of premonition or clairvoyance, just happens. Don't know why. It's
yeah. So 24 hours before the Aberfan disaster, Hencher was working overtime at the GPO's International Switchboard in Faraday House in London.
And just for anyone listening who might not know, the GPO, or General Post Office, back then was essentially the entire communications network for the UK. The postal service and all the telecommunications. It's why in a lot of old postal buildings, like, sort of old post office centres in big towns, you've got all like the big cool masts on the top and the old school sort of, telecommunications stuff, because it just basically, that run it all through the whole country.
Yeah. And he mentioned that most of his premonitions usually started with these terrible headaches, like a band of steel around my head that would get worse over several days. But this time before Aberfan, it was instant, apparently. He wrote, "It just hit me without warning. I began to tremble all over the body, felt lethargic, and found it very difficult to concentrate on my work." And then he apparently just casually mentioned to a woman sitting next to him, who'd asked if he was feeling ill, that a big disaster was taking place in this country, which could cost many lives. He added that he couldn't ever pinpoint the exact location, but you can imagine her reaction to that. He even wrote, "The lady has looked at me in a very worried fashion since, and it seems has avoided being near me."
Yeah, you can imagine so. Can you blame her? It's quite a statement to hear from a co-worker. Maybe I'm going to start doing it to mine, just freak him out. Barker, determined to broaden the experiment, didn't just stop with the initial article either. He cast a wider net. Following up with more requests for premonitions in other papers, the Institute for Psychophysical Research also put out a call, and they received about 200 submissions about Aberfan. At this point, Barker was seriously thinking about writing a book on the whole subject. And then Barker and Fairley, who, remember Peter Fairley, the science editor who published the original article, they approached Charles Wintour, the editor of the Evening Standard, with a pretty wild idea. They wanted to open what they coined the Premonitions Bureau. So for a year they invited readers to send in their dreams and forebodings. The idea was to collate these submissions and then compare them against actual happenings to see if there were any real correlations. And here's where it gets even more weird, shall we say. On the very day the article was published announcing the Premonitions Bureau with the headline, "If You Dream of Disaster,"
at that exact moment, almost to the minute, Donald Campbell was attempting to break the water speed record on Lake Coniston in the Lake District. As the article went to press, Campbell died during his attempt. The wake from his first run hadn't even cleared as he pushed Bluebird to over 320 miles per hour. At the critical moment, Bluebird rose, somersaulted in midair, then fell back, striking the water and breaking in two. Campbell was killed instantly, suffering multiple fractures. The craft hit the water with an impact velocity of 185 miles per hour. But the reason we bring up Campbell's record attempt here is because he was known to be a superstitious man. He'd apparently had a bad feeling for days leading up to it, and then, during a game of patience, he drew the Ace of Spades and the Queen, something he'd reportedly said Mary, Queen of Scots, had done just before her beheading in 1587.
So the Premonitions Bureau was officially underway. So as I said, the Bureau was underway, operating out of Fairley's pretty small office. He was joined by his assistant, Jennifer Preston, who apparently had a deep interest in the occult herself. And they started collecting. Fast forward then to January 1967, just 2 weeks after they properly kicked off the experiment. Barker claimed in an article for the Medical News that there were over 10,000 incidents recorded in parapsychology journals. But even with that huge number, he wanted more. He was actually concerned that the Bureau would just become this massive collection of isolated anecdotes, and he really wanted to find a way to use these reports.
To prevent future disasters, right? I mean, that was the big goal.
Yeah, precisely. He said, and I'm quoting him here, "If only one major catastrophe could be shown to have been prevented by his means, the project would have more than justified itself, perhaps for all time." He wasn't just collecting, he was hoping to genuinely avert tragedy. And they actually got their first major hit, their first significant prediction, in the spring of 1967.
Yeah, it was March 21st, 6 a.m. The phone rings in the dining room at Barker's home. He goes downstairs, answers it, and it's Alan Hencher again.
Was that the post office switchboard operator we talked about who freaked out his co-worker, yeah?
Yeah, that's the one. Hencher, who had just finished a night shift, sounds totally distraught on the phone. He tells Barker, "I was hoping not to have to ring you, but now I feel I must. What he was calling to predict was a plane crash. He'd had a vision of a Caravelle, that's a French-built passenger jet, having problems soon after takeoff. He saw it coming over mountains. He is going to radio it, is in trouble, then it will cut out. Nothing. He said there would be 123 or 124 people on board and that only one person would survive in a very poor condition. But he couldn't pinpoint the location. He'd had this feeling for 2 or 3 days, like someone on the aircraft was trying to communicate with him, trying to make peace. He even told Barker he was directed to the crash by a light flashing on and off.
And then, just 9 days later...
And then...
A turboprop Britannia passenger aircraft carrying 130 people attempts to land in Nicosia in Cyprus during a massive thunderstorm. It was on its way back from Bangkok to Basel in Switzerland, packed mostly with Swiss and German holidaymakers. They'd refueled in India and were heading for their second to last stop in Cairo when the pilots got the message that Cairo airport was shut due to heavy rain. The flight plan suggested that Beirut was an alternative, but the captain, a British pilot named Michael Muller, decided to make an unscheduled stop in Cyprus instead, despite the rotten weather. By the time they reached the island, they'd been in the air for almost 10 hours. Muller and his co-pilot were nearly 3 hours over their legal time limits at the controls, which was a major factor. At 11:10 p.m, the aircraft was cleared to land at Nicosia, but it came in a bit high. Muller asked for permission to do another circuit at the airport and try again. The control tower actually glimpsed the plane, its landing lights flashing through the low cloud before it wheeled south and clipped a wing on the side of a hill, just 22 feet from the summit. It rolled over, broke into pieces, and caught fire.
The next morning, the Evening Standard's front page screamed, 124 die in airliner. The final death toll was actually 126. 2 people who initially survived were taken to a nearby UN field hospital but died there. At the time, that Nicosia crash was the 6th worst aviation accident in history, and Furley and Barker immediately saw the chilling similarities with Hench's prediction. The Evening Standard didn't waste any time. They published an account of Hench's premonition right alongside the news coverage that very day. The headline read, "The incredible story of the man who dreamed disaster."
1 a.m, the day after the plane crash, Hench called Barker. He sounded agitated. He told Barker he was worried for his safety. He thought there might be some kind of accident. When he thought of Barker, his mind filled with the colour black. Barker asked him if he was telling him his life was in danger. Yes, Hench replied. Barker, in his correspondence with another of the percipients, it is a weird word, isn't it? Miss Middleton, who we mentioned earlier, had asked whether they too were worried about him. She said, "I had some personal concerns. I remember thinking that the work you were doing was so important that prayer must be said for your well-being." And Miss Middleton herself had another hit. In March, she dreamed of her deceased father taking a phone call in the living room about danger at sea. She notified Barker, and within 2 days, the Tory Canyon, which was a massive oil tanker on its way to Wales, ran aground between the Scilly Isles and Cornwall. It became Britain's worst ever oil spill.
Yeah, she did seem to have a knack for getting things right, didn't she? In April that year, she wrote to Barker warning of a hurricane or tornado on the west coast of America. 11 days later, an outbreak of 40 tornadoes across 5 Midwestern states killed 33 people. Not quite the West Coast, and perhaps we could argue that these things are common enough to just throw a prediction out there. But then there's the space one. On April 23rd, 1967, Miss Middleton sent in a vision of an astronaut on his way to the moon. She wrote, "This venture will end in tragedy." The spaceman she saw was petrified, terrified, and just frightened. She even enclosed a drawing, as she sometimes did, of an astronaut crouched inside a crude spherical craft.
She posted that message in Edmonton at 5:30 p.m. on a Sunday. Around the very same time, Vladimir Mikhailovich Komarov, who was a 40-year-old Soviet cosmonaut, was actually in orbit in the Soyuz 1 spacecraft on his 12th trip around the Earth. News of the launch had only just been released, so it's possible she knew someone was in space, but certainly not the specific grim details. The Soyuz 1 mission was technically dangerous and under massive political pressure from the Soviets trying to impress and outdo the Americans. There were known design flaws. Engineers had identified over 100 problems with Soyuz 1 and 2, and just 9 days before the launch. Even the lead for the cosmonaut training program wrote in his diary, "There is no confidence."
But they pushed ahead, and sure enough, just 18 minutes into the mission, Komarov's problems started. A solar panel failed, telemetry wasn't working, a sensor fogged up, the historic docking mission was scrapped. Komarov was told to prepare for an early return. He was an experienced pilot, dedicated. Even though the flight was going sideways, he kept a brave face, saying he felt excellent. Yuri Gagarin, the first man in space, was actually his close friend and was the main voice Komarov heard, guiding him as he tried to steer the craft manually through re-entry. But on his first 2 attempts at re-entry, the engines failed, and the spacecraft bounced back into orbit. On the 3rd try, with batteries low and flying by the stars, Komarov finally made it through the atmosphere. He even managed a "thank you to everyone."
But then the spacecraft's parachutes failed. Horrifically, the Soyuz fell until it hit open ground in southern Russia at 6:24 a.m. The wreckage caught fire. Komarov was burned to a brick, essentially. His remains, when recovered, were barely recognisable. It was an absolute disaster. The investigation later found the parachutes had a design flaw, where they were never going to work in the first place. Komarov's difficulties during the mission had nothing to do with his death. He'd overcome them with incredible skill, only to be killed by something that was always destined to go wrong. And in a twist of fate, the problems on Komarov's rocket actually saved the lives of the 3 cosmonauts who were supposed to join him the next day, because Soyuz 2 had the exact same parachute flaw. If it had launched, they would have failed too. Komarov was the first person to die during a space flight, and his ashes were interred within the walls of the Kremlin. I was just going to add there as well, Yuri Gagarin was actually, I think, supposed to be the astronaut on that flight, but I think given the confidence or lack of, Komarov basically said, "No, you can't, I'm going to do it," and insisted that he did it, and Yuri wanted to do it. And yeah, there was a big sort of disagreement between them, not an unfriendly one, but they both knew it was a dangerous flight.
Wasn't Komarov the one who also hadn't told his wife he was going to space?
Potentially, yeah.
I think he said, I'm going to work, and then the next thing she knew, he'd crashed to Earth.
Yeah, it's really...
It's pretty messed up.
They had, I know there was astronauts lost as well, obviously, you had the 2 shuttles, one that went up, was destroyed leaving, and one on re-entry, and then one of the early Apollo missions died, the astronauts actually died in a fire on the launch pad. But, some of the stuff the cosmonauts went through was really rough, and something that I meant to maybe cover in a future episode. But all this going on for Barker, despite the tragedy, this was another massive validation. He was thrilled by Miss Middleton's premonition. He wrote to her, "You were spot on. Well done."
The predictions kept coming, and on May the 1st, just a few days after the Komarov disaster and 34 days before the crash we're about to talk about, Hencher called Barker again, warning of yet another air disaster. He actually wondered if he was just suffering after effects from the Cyprus premonition, but this new vision felt different. He told Barker, "The plane has sweeping tail fins." Hencher thought the crash would happen within 3 weeks, though he didn't know where. More than 60 people would die, he told Barker. There'd be some miraculous escapes and a number of survivors. He felt a lot of emotion concerning this. I feel a great sadness. And when Barker pressed him about the victims, Hencher replied, "From the feeling I get, there may be a lot of children involved."
Barker logged this call at 9 p.m. and, clearly rattled, passed on Hencher's message in a letter to Fairley the very next night. It was late, and Barker seemed genuinely dazed by the sheer weight of this information. He wrote, "Just as I am about to turn into bed, it is indeed a terrible thing to reflect that there are now only 2 people in the world who know that some 60 people will die in a plane crash in 3 weeks' time. What are these people doing now? If only I could warn them somehow." Barker captured his despair in another letter to Fairley. "What if Miss Mr. Hencher is right again, but how can we stop it? If we could, then Mr. Hencher would not be warned of this possible terrible tragedy in the way that he was.
Yeah, I mean, this is the core issue, isn't it? If you can truly predict a future disaster and prevent it, does that vision, that warning then cease to exist? If it's prevented, was it ever going to happen in the first place for someone to foresee? It's kind of a proper paradox.
And, don't know if you watch Final Destination, but, that doesn't always end well. It's also what they call the Jonah's quandary. It comes from the old Bible story of Jonah, where he warns a city that is going to be destroyed, but then the city repents and it isn't destroyed. So if the prediction doesn't come true because of the warning, then was the warning even real in the first place? It's a bit of a mind bender for anyone trying to study premonitions, I suppose.
It's as Barker put it, he was as frustrated as he was excited. He wrote, "If only we could get more information. Perhaps someone else in England is like Mr. Hencher and has also been warned of this, but does not know of our scheme. If only we had more details. If only." He was desperate for clarity. And then the inevitable happened. Hotel Golf, that was the call sign of a propeller-driven British Midland C4 Argonaut, came down in the town of Stockport, just a few miles from Manchester Airport. It was shortly after 10 o'clock on a Sunday morning in June. The plane was packed with holidaymakers heading back from Palma, Mallorca. A few minutes before it was due to land, it mysteriously lost power. In the space of 20 seconds, 2 of its 4 engines cut out. The pilot, Captain Harry Marlowe, reported a little bit of trouble and suggested he'd make a turn around the airport.
But the plane just kept slowing and falling. It dropped below the clouds, and people on the outskirts of Manchester on a drizzly morning actually looked up and saw the passengers waving down at them. 6 miles short of the runway, Hotel Golf was only 200 feet above the ground. It crashed into a patch of industrial wasteland called Hope's Car, one of the few sparsely inhabited parts of Stockport. 72 people died. Captain Marlowe was one of only 12 survivors pulled from the cockpit with head injuries and a broken jaw. And Hencher's prediction about more than 60 people dying and miraculous escapees was grimly accurate.
So during 1967, the Bureau was getting premonitions every single day. Most were impossible to verify, but in total they logged 469 warnings. And they had more hits. On May 22nd, Lynn Singh from Thetford in Norfolk described a dream she had the night before of a tremendous conflagration at a considerable distance. She saw a large building with huge girders, flames leaping 100 feet high, and sudden brilliant flashes every few seconds, which would seem to indicate mighty explosions. And at almost the exact moment Singh posted her letter, 2:45 p.m. on a Monday, the fire crews reached La Innovation, this massive Art Deco department store on the Rue Neuve in Brussels. Flames were soaring up its central atrium to a glass roof supported by arching iron beams, just as she described. Horrifically, 251 people lost their lives in that fire. It consumed the building within minutes and remains Belgium's worst peacetime disaster. The fire flashed and raged, fed by exploding butane gas tanks in the camping department. Another incredibly specific, horrifying match.
Then, just 2 weeks later, on June the 5th, the Egyptian army blocked both ends of the Suez Canal, marking the start of the Six-Day War with Israel. This actually fulfilled a prophecy made by Michael Sandgrove of King's Lynn, who had dreamed of a merchant ship stuck in Suez Canal about the end of May. 15 cargo vessels end up being trapped in the canal for the next 8 days. The 1967 Grand National was won by Foinavon, a massive 100-to-1 outsider, after this extraordinary pile-up at a pretty innocuous fence. The day after the race, a young Australian named George Cramner called the Bureau, claiming he had dreamt of the Foinavon's colours the night before and knew the horse was going to win. Fairley, of course, invited Cramner to call again, and on the morning of the Epsom Derby, 2 months later, a friend of Cramner's called and put him on the line. Cramner was nervous, but he said he'd dreamed of a set of jockey colours and had seen a vision of the winning horse being led away. This time the colours belonged to Riboko, a 20-to-1 shot. Riboko actually came second in the Derby, but then won the Irish Derby the following month. Sounds like quite a useful premonition, really, that one. Maybe. Well, not that one, because it lost that Derby, but...
So back to Miss Middleton. On November 1st, she found herself feeling acutely depressed. Sitting in her kitchen in Edmonton, she said, "Gradually, I saw a streak, then a flash of light, then a sort of grey mist. I was trying to find out where it was. The word train kept coming through. Train, train." She put her vision in a note to the Bureau. "I see a crash, maybe on a railway. A station may be involved. People waiting in the station and the words Charing Cross and the sounds of a crash." And get this, on October 11th, Hencher had also written in, warning of a mainline rail crash where many people would be killed and 2 carriages would come to rest, one on top of the other. So, November 5th, the 7:43 p.m. express service left Hastings on England's south coast heading for Charing Cross. It had been a mild day, but the evening turned cold and wet. The train was packed with day trippers and office workers heading back to the capital.
By the time it reached Sevenoaks, 22 miles from Charing Cross, it switched drivers. And it was running 4 minutes late, with passengers standing in the corridors. It was packed. The new driver was Donald Purves, who'd worked that line for 9 years. As the train clattered through Grove Park, a small suburban station in southeast London, Purves prepared to apply the air brake to slow from 70 to 60 miles an hour. When he reached for the brake, Purves felt a momentary drag on the 750-foot-long train, weighing almost 500 tons. He wondered if he'd engaged it too soon. That drag was actually the train derailing. A set of wheels at the front from the third carriage had hit a 5-inch break in the tracks and jumped the rails. A signalman at Hither Green, the next station, saw a shower of sparks. Passengers thought it sounded like running over glass or rocks hitting the carriages. A guard shouted at people to get on the floor.
The train stayed upright for 423 metres before the derailed wheels hit a junction and flipped 4 carriages onto their sides. People were thrown about like dolls. 2 carriages had their sides ripped off, windows smashed, roofs crushed, chairs, luggage, everything thrown onto the track. Purves said, "Everything happened so fast." His engine car came to a halt 220 yards down the track on its own. When he climbed down, the rest of the train was just gone. The wreckage lay across a bridge over St Mildred's Road, just short of Hither Green Station and about 8 miles from Charing Cross. 49 people died, though initially the toll was thought to be much higher.
And at the time of the crash, Alan Hencher was on a shift at the GPO. He complained of a severe headache and was taken to the sick bay. At 10:15, he wrote a note saying he thought there'd been a railway accident and that it might have happened about an hour ago. The train had come off the rails at Hither Green at 9:16 p.m. Miss Middleton's Charing Cross prediction and Hencher's turn in sick bay put the Premonitions Bureau right back in the headlines. So, by the spring of 1968, after 15 months of the Bureau being open, Barker had collected 723 predictions from the public. Fairley then wrote up the findings and, based on their scoring system, calculated that 18 of the warnings from 67 had so far come true, a hit rate of just over 3%.
Yeah, it's low, but it's not nothing, as Fairley pointed out, and he noted that most of the predictions were still just that, predictions. The future was still wide open. He wrote, "So little is known of the role of time in this phenomenon that it is impossible to say they will never come true." And they announced the Standard would run the experiment for another year to amass more material and observe certain people more closely. And the Bureau's success rate was definitely more impressive if you focus on the visions of Miss Middleton and Alan Hencher. Among their many warnings, they'd contributed 12 out of those 18 apparently successful premonitions.
Fairley actually reported that these two, if the evidence is accepted, appear to act as human seismometers who get early warnings of disaster. Hencher, of course, had foreseen the Cyprus and the Stockport air crashes. Miss Middleton had the death of Vladimir Koromov, and both had given convincing warnings of the Hither Green crash. And a few days after Christmas, Miss Middleton had another hit. She envisaged an unusual collision involving a truck carrying an exceptionally heavy load. 7 days later, on January the 6th, 1968, a low loader carrying a 120-ton electrical transformer was hit by an express train on a level crossing in Hixon in Staffordshire. 11 people were killed. In Fairley's second article about the Bureau, he described how the music teacher and the telephone operator perceived their visions. Miss Middleton said, I see a picture projected in front of my eyes. Often it was a single object, a building, a train, a car. Words flashed as if in neon. A day or two later, she'd have the same vision again, but with more details. Hench's premonitions were always accompanied by pain, particularly at the back of his skull, where he'd suffered a head injury. It felt like a migraine, he told Furley. Sometimes I see things in black and white, sometimes in colour. I never get pleasant premonitions. He said the pain went away when he sent in his warnings. And when the disaster occurred, the words, "It has happened," would just pop into his mind, either as words or a voice only he could hear.
The percipients even got photographed for the standard. Miss Middleton smiled gamely. Hencher in a V-neck sweater was holding secateurs next to a tree. The attention was stimulating, but it also started to cause problems. Early on, Hencher had already complained to Barker about how paying attention to all his visions was affecting his mental health, and that feeling had just festered. Now Miss Middleton was starting to feel exploited too. After being identified as the experiment's stars, Hencher and Miss Middleton, who were both somewhat isolated, decided to join forces. The Bureau found out. On April 8th, Hencher sent a letter to Fairley, timestamped 6:22 a.m, reporting his latest premonition.
An aircraft, 74 passengers, tipped on its side, and Finland comes into this. Don't know why.
Though I can find nothing to suggest that this one came true. In the same letter, he laid out a number of grievances and made it clear they were comparing notes. They're cheating!
Well, indeed. In the following days, Hencher sent Fairley 2 more letters of increasing intensity, making it clear that things couldn't go on as before. He and Miss Middleton wanted reports of all their premonitions returned. They were even collaborating on a book. He warned, "It's going to be rather outspoken on certain points and will probably annoy various people." He then delivered this strained emotional passage, trying to make Fairley understand what it was like. "Do those who record our predictions really understand what it entails to make predictions? We have to undergo the torment of knowing that whatever we say, however long we pray, that when we receive, we have the problem deciding whether we should tell what we've received, because if we don't, and it happens to be, and it, I'll go from because if we don't, and it happens we cannot be believed, and so suffer equally by the knowledge that we are doing something that could be of public use, and by reason of the partial publicity, and here and there perhaps, if it is sensational enough, that this very public must start to see us as cranks, so creating even greater stress mentally to the nervous system." It was wordy. He was upset, and they wanted recognition and a little bit of looking after. And frankly, some money wouldn't hurt. Hencher wrote, "We have reached the point of no return. We have become known. This cannot be undone by turning the clock back." He was clearly suspicious of what Fairley and the Evening Standard were getting out of it.
The Seers were never as respectful towards Fairley as they were towards Barker, and Fairley, it seemed, was never quite as taken by them. He waited 5 days before replying to Hencher's ultimatum. Fairley wrote back,
"While I understand that to both Miss Middleton and yourself the experiences you undergo are disturbing and intriguing, I would urge you to resist the temptation to exaggerate them and claim for yourselves a power which you may not in fact possess."
Fair.
Which brings us to another chilling prediction, this time from Miss Middleton about Bobby Kennedy. She was so certain he'd be killed that she claimed her Massachusetts upbringing gave her special insight into the family. On March 11th, she wrote to Barker, warning of an assassination. 4 days later, she wrote again,
"The word assassination continues. I cannot disconnect it from Robert Kennedy. It may be history will repeat itself."
Later that month, she even told an American journalist that 2 men weren't safe, Charles de Gaulle and Robert Kennedy, but she repeated her warnings about Kennedy throughout April. She called the Premonitions Bureau 3 times on June the 4th, warning that a killing was imminent. And in the early hours of June 5th, after declaring victory in the California primary, Kennedy was shot in the head shortly after midnight as he cut through the kitchen of the Ambassador Hotel. For Barker, this was Miss Middleton's most chillingly accurate prediction yet. He wrote to her,
"You were insistent, and you were spot on."
And the pressure and emotional toll wasn't just on the recipients. Towards the end of that month, Barker himself began to suffer headaches which just got worse and worse, often intolerable. He was admitted to Copthorne Hospital in Shrewsbury, but even from his bed, he continued to work and write letters. His wife, Jane, wrote later, he was not the kind of person to give in and always wanted to get on with the job. Then, on the night of the 27th of July, Miss Middleton had another dream, which she interpreted as a further warning to Barker. She was standing in a boarding house by the sea, and her dead parents were with her. She recalled, "For a brief period, we were happy, and we had tea." But then her mother rose and climbed into a black car, pushing Miss Middleton away. She chased after the car briefly, and afterwards understood that the dream seemed to indicate the passing of someone close to her. When she woke up, she felt like she was in a trance, dulled and detached from the world. At lunchtime, she posted a note to the Premonitions Bureau. "This may mean death."
Then one Sunday morning, as Barker's family were downstairs, they heard Barker's laboured breathing coming through the ceiling. He was on the bedroom floor. A vessel had burst in his brain. John Barker died in hospital in Shrewsbury on August 20th, 1968. His death and the warning that preceded it made the front page of the Psychic News. Bet they didn't see that coming.
Oh! The morning before he died, Miss Middleton woke, again with a choking sensation. After Barker's death, she sent most of her premonitions to the Central Premonitions Registry in New York. She died in 1999, surrounded by her cats. So it is said. After Barker's death, Alan Hencher dropped out of contact with the Bureau and moved to Suffolk. Jane Barker remarried happily and died in 2014 at the age of 90. Peter Fairley, the science editor, went on to become known as the Face of Space for his work on British television, presenting the moon landings and chronicling NASA missions in the 60s and 70s. He died in 1998 at the age of 67.
The Premonitions Bureau itself continued to collect visions and forebodings from the British public into the 70s. Jennifer Preston catalogued them with care. She welcomed paranormal investigators and journalists to her house in Charlton, but she longed for someone to take up the project seriously again. She told the Evening Post in 1973,
"They're keen on hearing about premonitions or witches or poltergeists, but nobody seems to want to do anything constructive."
By the time the experiment finally ended, Preston had a collection of more than 3,000 premonitions, about 1,200 of which had been checked, all stored in filing cabinets in her house. But despite all the predictions, despite all the hits, the warnings, the agony of the percipients, no early warnings were ever officially issued to prevent any disaster.
So, what was the main source for this episode, Craig, apart from my sterling work covering it on a previous episode, of course?
Yeah, I just took your script from last time
And made it legible.
I added some words.
You're Craig, you've got a book.
I do have a book. Can you guess what it's called?
Is it the Premonitions Bureau?
Oh, you saw that coming, didn't you? Yes, this
Yeah.
one here by Sam Knight. There's a lot of other stuff in there too. As usual, we've had to condense it down to make it fit an episode. But if you want to dive more into it, there is more in there.
Yeah, it's a pretty fascinating topic. As I said, it's I was in when I first looked into it for the Dreams episode. I was like, oh, this is it seems like a cheesy sort of supernatural kind of program from the 90s, doesn't it, in a way? But or in this case, the 60s. But
yeah, I mean,
like,
I don't know whether we discussed this last time you did it. Like, what do you think about it? Do you think any of the stuff was real premonitions? Do you think they're all crackers?
don't know if we're taking what he said about their reports at face value. Some of it does seem a bit weird. But then he doesn't also, I don't know, he might do in that book, I haven't read it, go into the amount of misses those people had as well.
No, it doesn't really. As I say, it does talk a bit more. Fairly does talk about the amount that are incorrect that they're receiving in general, not of those.
And also, nowadays, if you had those predictions, let's say about plane crashes, and they came true, you might think that's spooky. But statistically speaking, in the 60s, there were a lot more plane crashes.
Yeah, I mean, I
So it
wonder.
could have been a crash like somewhere, unless they specified the actual place or
Yeah,
the name.
they're vague enough.
Yeah, like if it's a plane crash, it had these sort of wings, and I'm getting this because he was wrong about, he's wrong about the actual airline sometimes and the actual model of plane. But like, and like a plane could crash like the other side of the world 3 or 4 weeks later, and you'd be like, "Yep, that was it." Like it could be a twin prop sort of engine, three-seater that crashes. You're like, "Yep, that's what I saw." Um, but I don't know.
Yeah,
I don't know. I kind of it's one of those things that I'm not convinced of, like most of this stuff. But I'm a little bit more open to premonitions and clairvoyance in that sense because you know it's not so much maybe predicting future events, but like a lot of these seem to happen around the time it happened, around the time the disaster happened.
I don't know. The time between prediction and disaster seem to vary quite a lot. I feel like if we throw out a prediction, then however many billions of people are on this planet, if everyone threw out a prediction, some of them would be right, right?
Yeah, of course, of course.
And
But
we remember the hits and we kind of forget the misses as well,
yeah, it's a
generally.
confirmation bias sort of thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's like, oh yeah, that happened that time, and yeah, I mean that you get that so much, whether it's like that weird feeling and then this happened, or I wish for this and this happened. All the times you wish for that thing to happen, it doesn't happen. It's like the whole power of positive thought. It does have an impact in the terms of when you think positively, you tend to go at things in a better way and are more successful. Absolutely. But that whole law of attraction stuff, for example, where it's like if you think it will happen, and if it doesn't happen, you're just not thinking hard enough. Well, that's convenient, isn't it? you know. And I think the same applies to premonitions, as just as you said, you forget the misses, or you just say, oh well, it must have been something else, or like perfect one, which we will do an episode one day ripping into. I'm sure is mediums. All the times they're like, I'm getting this, I'm getting you're scared about money. Yeah, everyone worries about money. And they're like, I'm getting an older man, Bill. No. Bob, no. Well, I'm going to leave that with you. It's like, you're wrong, but we're just going to say we're right at some point.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. It's always the fault of the person for not being able to fit it, right?
exactly. So I think a
Yeah.
lot of that kind of transfers over to this a little bit.
Well, I'm going to make a premonition. I think there's going to be some weird news on After Weird coming up.
I didn't want to say anything, but I've also had a similar premonition. I won't put it out there too much that we're collaborating on this, otherwise the Bureau will get upset. But yeah, if anyone's interested, she's definitely come over and check us out. We carry on this chat in afterward. We will discuss the latest weird news and yeah, whatever else takes our interest. I've got a few interesting bits to talk about. Um, yeah, quite relevant going back to the mediums and things like that, actually. So you can find that in your podcast app, in on our website, and on YouTube and various other places.
Yes, and remember to sign up for free on our Substack to get notifications on new episodes. That's www.wyrdwessex.co.uk. You can also support us by paying us if you want to contribute towards the cost of running the show and help towards the hours of research we do to bring you this show.
Yep, absolutely. Much appreciated if you can do that. Mostly Craig researching. I do the odd little bit. But yeah, it all very much helps. And this does take a fair bit of time. It doesn't always come naturally to us just off the cuff. So thank you very much. And until next time,
Stay weird.
and me.
Ah.